I'll never forget that crisp November morning in 2021. It started like any other day at our suburban high school in Michigan, with students shuffling through the halls and the usual buzz of morning conversations. I was sitting in my first period chemistry class, barely awake and struggling to focus on molecular structures, when the intercom crackled to life at 9:47 a.m. Lockdown, lockdown, lockdown. This is not a drill. The assistant principal's voice was steady but urgent. In that instant, everything changed. Our teacher, Mrs. Peterson, sprang into action with a speed that suggested she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her head. She quickly locked the door, killed the lights, and gestured for us to move to the designated safe corner, the area of the classroom not visible from the hallway windows. 23 of us huddled together in absolute silence. The only sounds were our shallow breaths and the occasional shuffle of someone trying to find a more comfortable position on the cold linoleum floor. Through the darkness, I could see my classmates' phones lighting up with texts from friends and family. My own phone buzzed silently in my pocket, a message from Mom asking if I was okay. I didn't dare respond yet. The first 10 minutes were the worst. We had no idea what was happening. Rumors started spreading through text messages. Someone had seen a man with a gun entering the freshman building. There were shots fired in the cafeteria. Multiple shooters were in the building. Later, we would learn that a student had spotted someone pulling into the parking lot with what looked like a rifle. But at that moment, every scenario played out in our minds like scenes from a horror movie. Mrs. Peterson stood by the door, occasionally peeking through the small window she had partially covered with paper. Her face remained composed, but her hands trembled slightly as she held her phone, waiting for updates from the school administration. The minutes crawled by like hours. My legs began to cramp from sitting in the same position, but I didn't dare move. The silence was occasionally broken by muffled sobs from somewhere in our huddled group. At 10:15 a.m., we heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, measured steps, multiple sets. My heart felt like it would explode out of my chest. Someone next to me started hyperventilating, and others quickly moved to comfort them while maintaining silence. The footsteps grew closer, and shadows appeared under our door. We could hear radio chatter now. It was the police conducting their sweep of the building. The door handle rattled, and several of us jumped. "Police! Everyone stay where you are," a voice commanded. Mrs. Peterson responded according to protocol, asking for official identification. We watched as a badge was pressed against the window, followed by the systematic entry of 3 SWAT team members. Their weapons were drawn, and they moved with practiced precision, checking every corner of the room. The officers explained that they needed to escort us out of the building. We were to leave everything behind: backpacks, phones, personal items, and exit with our hands visible above our heads. As we stood up, my legs nearly buckled from being cramped for so long. The reality of the situation hit me as we formed a single-file line. This wasn't a drill, and we were being treated as both potential victims and suspects. The walk through the hallway was surreal. Emergency lights cast everything in an eerie red glow. Papers were scattered across the floor, along with abandoned backpacks and water bottles, evidence of the panic when the lockdown was first announced. We passed the bathroom, where I had fixed my hair just 2 hours earlier, now cordoned off with police tape. I later learned that they were checking every possible hiding place, treating the entire school as an active crime scene. Outside, the scene was chaos contained within order. Dozens of police vehicles, ambulances, and fire trucks filled the parking lot. News helicopters circled overhead. Parents were gathered behind police barriers, straining to spot their children. We were led to a designated reunification area, where officials checked our IDs and crossed our names off lists before allowing us to join our families. The entire ordeal lasted 3 hours and 17 minutes. The reported gunman turned out to be a contractor arriving to repair the HVAC system, carrying what a student had mistaken for a rifle but was actually specialized equipment. In the end, we were safe. But those 3 hours changed us all. The fear was real, the threat was real, and despite the false alarm, everything we did that day was necessary because we couldn't know it wasn't real until it was over. When we returned to school 2 days later, things were different. The building was the same, but we weren't. Every unexplained noise made us jump. Every lockdown drill that followed brought back the raw fear of that day. Teachers started keeping their doors locked at all times. Students developed new habits, always knowing where the nearest exit was, keeping phones on silent but always within reach, mentally rehearsing what to do if it happened again. The incident made local news but was quickly forgotten by the outside world. Just another false alarm in an era where school shootings have become tragically commonplace. But for those of us who lived through those 3 hours, it left an indelible mark. We learned that fear doesn't need confirmation to be real, that bravery often looks like sitting in silence, and that safety is something we can never take for granted. Even now, years later, I sometimes find myself scanning rooms for hiding spots or flinching at unexpected announcements over intercoms. It's a subtle form of PTSD that many of us carry, not from what did happen, but from what could have happened. And perhaps that's the most terrifying part of the whole experience, knowing that somewhere in another school, on another ordinary morning, students just like us might find themselves in the same situation, but with a very different ending. It was the last week before winter break in December 2018, and the morning air in California was unusually cold. As a fifth-grade teacher, I was looking forward to the holiday season as much as my students. The playground was dusted with a rare frost that morning, making everything look like it was sprinkled with sugar. None of us could have predicted how this peaceful winter day would turn into a nightmare. My class was in the middle of our morning reading session. 24 students sat cross-legged on our reading carpet, engrossed in their books. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, unusual for our typically sunny region. The classroom felt cozy and safe, fairy lights twinkling around our reading corner, student artwork decorating every wall. That peaceful scene was shattered at 10:23 a.m. when our principal's voice cut through the silence. Code red. Code red. This is not a drill. All teachers initiate lockdown procedures immediately. Her voice was different from our drill practices. Tighter, more urgent. Later, we would learn that a domestic dispute had spilled onto school grounds. An armed man had followed his estranged wife, a parent at our school, after she dropped off their child. A staff member had spotted him jumping the fence near the kindergarten playground, weapon visible. Years of drills kicked in automatically. I quickly locked both doors, killed the lights, and closed the blinds. My students knew exactly what to do. We had practiced this monthly. They quietly moved to our designated safe space, a storage closet connected to our classroom. It was tight, but we had organized it specifically for this purpose. The irony wasn't lost on me. A space normally filled with art supplies and science materials was now our shelter from potential violence. Thunder rumbled outside as we huddled in the darkness. I could hear helicopters approaching. Whether news or police, I couldn't tell. My phone vibrated. A message from our administration warning us that the suspect was still at large on campus. I held my breath every time footsteps passed our door, trying to project calm for my students while my own heart raced. Some children were silently crying, others sitting in shocked stillness. Time became fluid in that closet. Minutes stretched like hours. We had emergency supplies in there. Water, snacks, even a portable toilet we'd never thought we'd actually need. Now, as the lockdown stretched on, they became necessities. I kept checking my phone, reading the district's updates in the local news, trying to piece together what was happening outside our safe bubble. The sound of K-9 units barking echoed through the hallways around 11:45 a.m. We could hear radio static and commands being shouted. The storm had intensified, and rain pounded against the building. One of my students, a bright girl named Sarah, whispered that it reminded her of the storms in Narnia. I smiled in the darkness. Leave it to a child to find literary connections even in crisis. At 12:30 p.m., we heard the first direct communication from outside our room. Police, identify yourself. I followed protocol, responding clearly while keeping the children silent and still. The door opened to reveal heavily armed officers, their tactical gear dripping from the rain. They quickly cleared our room and the closet, then explained they would be escorting us to the gymnasium for evacuation. The gym had been transformed into a processing center. Other classes were already there, students sitting in neat rows while officers and administrators worked to coordinate the evacuation. The rain created a constant backdrop of white noise against the high windows. I kept my students together, counting heads repeatedly, irrationally afraid of losing one in the controlled chaos. The evacuation process was methodical. Buses had been brought in, positioned strategically around the building. Parents were directed to a separate location for reunification. We would later learn that this was standard procedure, keeping parents away from the immediate area both for their safety and to maintain control of the situation. The storm had flooded parts of the parking lot, and we had to guide students carefully through the water to reach the buses. As we waited for our turn to evacuate, we learned more about what had happened. The armed man had been cornered in the school's maintenance area. No shots had been fired, but he had threatened several staff members who encountered him. The combination of the storm and the situation had created a perfect storm of chaos, but the security protocols had worked exactly as designed. The suspect was apprehended at 1:15 p.m., attempting to escape through a service tunnel. By then, half the school had been evacuated. When our turn came, we walked through halls that felt alien in the emergency lighting. Papers floated in puddles where rain had seeped in through doors opened during the search. A child's drawing of a rainbow lay soaked on the floor, a stark reminder of the innocence that had been disrupted. The aftermath was almost as challenging as the incident itself. The school counselors were overwhelmed in the following weeks. Many students struggled with anxiety about returning to school. Our safe, nurturing space had been violated, and restoring that sense of security took time. We installed additional security cameras, reinforced fences, and implemented stricter visitor protocols, but the emotional scars took longer to heal. Looking back now, what stands out most isn't the fear or the chaos, but the resilience. My students, mere children, showed extraordinary courage and composure. They followed instructions perfectly, supported each other silently, and proved themselves capable of handling a crisis that no child should ever have to face. When we returned to school the following week, one of my students had drawn a picture of our class as superheroes, labeled the Brave Bunch of Room 23. The incident changed us all. As a teacher, I became more vigilant, more protective. Every sound in the hallway triggered a moment of heightened awareness, but it also strengthened our classroom community. We talked openly about our fears, celebrated our bravery, and worked together to reclaim our sense of safety. That winter morning taught us all that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about facing your fears together and finding strength in unity. The evening of October 2017 started like any other night at our university library in Oregon. As a graduate student working the late shift at the reference desk, I was used to the quiet atmosphere that settled over the building after sunset. The massive 5-story library always felt different at night, more imposing, more mysterious. The fog that had rolled in from the coast added an extra layer of isolation to our already quiet campus. It was just past 9:30 p.m., and I was helping a couple of students with research papers while monitoring the security feeds, a standard part of my job during evening hours. Most floors were nearly empty, typical for a Wednesday night. The soft hum of the heating system and the gentle tapping of keyboards created a peaceful ambiance. That peace was shattered by the sudden blare of the campus-wide emergency alert system. Every computer screen in the library simultaneously flashed red with the alert: armed suspect on campus. Shelter in place immediately. This is not a drill. The campus alert system also sent text messages and emails, causing phones throughout the building to buzz and chime in an eerie chorus. My training kicked in, but this was different from our drills. This was happening at night, in a massive building with multiple entrances and far fewer staff. I immediately triggered the library's lockdown procedure. which automatically locked all external doors. But we had at least 60 students spread across 5 floors and only 3 staff members on duty. The police report would later reveal that a man had robbed a convenience store near campus, shot the clerk, and been spotted heading toward the university grounds. We didn't know any of this at the time. We just knew we had to secure everyone inside. Working with the other 2 staff members via our radio system, we began the process of gathering everyone into designated safe zones. The library had several secure rooms, windowless spaces designed for archival storage that would serve as our shelter areas. The endless rows of bookshelves, normally so familiar, now felt like a maze of shadows and potential hiding places. Every corner could conceal danger. The most terrifying part was moving through the building, floor by floor, searching for students who might be wearing headphones or tucked away in quiet study rooms, unaware of the danger. We found 3 students in soundproof study pods on the 4th floor, completely oblivious to the situation. The look of fear that crossed their faces when we explained what was happening still haunts me. At 10:15 p.m., we received another alert. The suspect had been spotted near the library's north entrance. The elevator was disabled as per protocol, but that meant we had students trapped on upper floors. We could hear police helicopters circling overhead, their searchlights occasionally sweeping across the library's windows, creating moving shadows that made everyone jump. We managed to gather most people in the basement archive room, a large, secure space with reinforced doors. The room, usually used for storing rare books, now held 47 terrified students and staff. The other secure room on the 3rd floor held another 15 people. The vintage air handling system in the basement hummed ominously, and the old pipes creaked and groaned above us, making everyone flinch. Time seemed to stop in that basement. We could hear movement above us, the tactical response team sweeping the building, we hoped. Every footstep, every creak, every distant sound became magnified. Students huddled in small groups, texting loved ones, some silently crying, others frozen in shock. I kept thinking about the handful of study rooms we hadn't been able to check before taking shelter. At 11:23 p.m., the building's power went out. The emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in a dim, reddish glow. Later, we learned that the severe weather had caused a transformer failure, but at the moment, it felt like a scene from a horror movie. The security cameras went dark, leaving us completely blind to what was happening above. Our emergency radio became our only link to the outside world. Just before midnight, we heard the distinctive sound of the tactical team reaching our floor. Their methodical room-by-room search was both reassuring and terrifying, each shout of "clear" making us jump. When they finally reached our door, the process of identifying ourselves and allowing them in was tense. The officers, heavily armed and soaked from the rain, quickly established a security perimeter. The evacuation process was surreal. We were led out in small groups, hands visible, escorted by armed officers. The library, a place I knew so intimately, had been transformed. Papers and personal belongings were scattered everywhere, evidence of the panic when the lockdown began. Doors hung open, chairs were overturned, and abandoned coffee cups sat on tables, their contents long cold. Outside, the scene was controlled chaos. Multiple police vehicles, SWAT teams, and FBI agents had surrounded the building. The suspect, as we later learned, had never actually entered the library. He had been caught trying to hide in a maintenance tunnel under the science building. But those 4 hours of uncertainty had changed us all forever. The incident made national news briefly. Another campus lockdown in an era where such things had become disturbingly common. The convenience store clerk survived, the suspect was arrested, and the university installed additional security measures. But the real impact was personal and lasting. The library staff implemented new safety protocols, including improved communication systems and additional secure rooms on each floor. For months afterward, every unexpected noise, every late-night shadow in the stacks made me freeze. The library's night shift was never quite the same. Some students stopped coming to study after dark. Others would only sit near emergency exits. I found myself constantly checking security cameras, counting exits, watching for anything unusual. The building's gentle nighttime quiet, once peaceful, now felt ominous. Years later, I still work in academic libraries, but that night changed how I view these spaces forever. Libraries are meant to be sanctuaries of knowledge, open and welcoming to all. But in today's world, that openness comes with risks we can't ignore. Every time I walk through the quiet stacks at night, I remember those 4 hours in the basement, and I'm grateful for the security measures we once thought we'd never need.